On a sunny autumn afternoon, the city's Central Park was peaceful, with just a few people enjoying the day. On one of the benches, a 10-year-old girl with brown hair tied in a ponytail watched others playing with their parents. Her name was Emily, a curious child with big eyes and an even bigger heart. She always looked for ways to help, even with small acts like sharing her snack with classmates at school or assisting her neighbor with groceries. That afternoon, as she walked with her mother toward the carousel, Emily spotted an elderly woman sitting in a dark corner of the park, near her usual bench. The woman, covered in a tattered shawl with messy grey hair, had her head down, holding a sign that read, "Hungry, any help is welcome." Emily stopped, watching the homeless woman with a mix of pity and compassion. Her stomach growled slightly. She wasn't hungry anymore since she'd already finished her snack. But something stirred inside her, something she couldn't explain. Without hesitation, she took the remaining sandwich from her lunch and handed it to the woman with a shy smile. "Here, I know it's a little cold, but I think you'll like it," Emily said in a soft voice. The woman looked up, surprised, as if unsure how to react to such a kind gesture. She smiled, a smile that seemed to last an eternity, and took the sandwich with trembling hands. "Thank you, my dear," the woman replied, almost breathless. Feeling content for having helped, Emily resumed walking next to her mother, who hadn't noticed what had just happened. However, something inside the girl kept her restless. She didn't know why, but she felt that this simple act of kindness wouldn't go unnoticed. Days later, Emily began noticing something strange. On several occasions, she saw men in black, wearing sunglasses and serious faces, watching her from a distance. At first, she thought it was just a coincidence, but as the days passed, the glances became more intense, as if she was being watched. One grey afternoon, as Emily was playing in the park, she heard a distant but growing sound of police sirens. Her heart raced when she realized the police were getting closer. She thought about running to her mother, but before she could take a step, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. In the center of the park, the elderly woman was surrounded by several officers, and beside her, a policeman seemed to be pulling something from his pocket. An urgent conversation was unfolding, but Emily couldn't understand the details. When one of the officers saw her, he quickly approached. "Do you know this woman?" he asked firmly. The girl didn't know how to respond. She never imagined that a simple act of giving a sandwich to a stranger would put her in a situation like this. She looked at the elderly woman, who now seemed scared, her mouth dry and their eyes met. I gave her food. I just gave her food," Emily stammered, unsure if her explanation made any sense. But the surprise was far from over. The elderly woman looked directly at the girl, and instead of asking for help, smiled. However, her smile wasn't one of gratitude. There was something else, something dark in her eyes. Something Emily couldn't understand. Emily had never known much about the elderly woman. Her mother always warned her not to approach strangers, but her instincts had guided her differently that day, leading her to do something that now seemed to have serious consequences. She didn't know why the woman, with her dirty appearance and grey hair, made her feel so uneasy. The beggar's thankful smile, although sincere, seemed to hide a dark secret. Emily didn't know it yet, but something in the woman's presence triggered a feeling that fate had marked her. The park, a quiet area in a residential neighborhood, was a place where children ran, families had picnics, and the elderly played dominoes under the shade of trees. But that day, there seemed to be an invisible tension hanging over the place. The sun was beginning to set, and the cold air was setting in, but something was still in the air. A feeling Emily couldn't quite describe. The police officers began to disperse, but two stayed near the beggar, while Emily felt the weight of the intense stares on her. One of them, a man with short hair and a stern expression, approached her again. "Are you sure you don't know her, girl?" he asked, his tone softer now, perhaps trying to ease the tension. Emily shook her head, feeling a weight in her chest. "I just gave her food. I don't know who she is. I don't understand what's happening." The officer glanced at the other officers, who were talking to the woman, making notes in a notebook. Then he kneeled down, bringing himself to Emily's level. "Do you know where she's going? Where does she live?" Emily frowned, thinking carefully. The woman didn't seem to have anywhere to go. She was always in the park, sitting on her bench, with a lost look on her face and an expression that reflected more exhaustion than anything else. "I don't know. She just stays there, on the bench." Before she could say more, a police car stopped beside them. A man in his late 50s, wearing sunglasses and a serious demeanor, stepped out. He walked toward the beggar, motioning for the officers to move away. The elderly woman looked even more uncomfortable now, her eyes moving nervously. "Stay out of this," the man said firmly to the other officers. "I'll handle the situation." Emily, unsure of what to do, watched from a distance. The woman seemed to recognize the new officer, but not in a friendly way. Her eyes narrowed as he approached, and the tension between them was palpable. "You should have stayed away, girl," the older officer suddenly said, looking directly at Emily. "I bet you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." The girl didn't know how to respond. All she knew was that by giving that simple sandwich, something had been triggered, and now she was involved in something much bigger than she could have imagined. What was really happening? Why were these officers so interested in her, a simple girl who just tried to be kind? Meanwhile, the elderly woman was led to the police car without resistance, but her gaze never left Emily. An intense stare, full of something dangerous, something the girl didn't understand. The next day, Emily couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She looked out the window of her room in the modest house where she lived with her parents and wondered why the woman had looked at her that way. Why did she seem so scared, yet so threatening at the same time? She tried to hide her worry, but it was impossible. Something was wrong, very wrong. And with every passing moment, Emily felt like the answer was closer than she had imagined. At school, her friends noticed she was quieter, more distant. They asked if she was okay, but Emily didn't know what to say. How could she explain what had happened? How could she talk about the growing feeling that something was watching her, even in the safest places? The days passed, but the unease didn't fade. On the contrary, it only grew. Whenever Emily walked past the park, she felt the weight of eyes on her, as though she was being watched. What had seemed like a simple act of kindness now felt like a heavy burden. And deep down, Emily knew her life would never be the same. She couldn't forget the woman's gaze, that smile that, though masked as gratitude, seemed to carry the weight of old secrets. She started observing the events more closely, as if something was unfolding right in front of her, but she still couldn't see the whole picture. Yet, she knew that things had changed forever. In the weeks that followed, Emily kept seeing the officers near the park, always in small groups, their faces serious as if they were hunting something. She tried talking to her mum about what had happened, but her mum just told her not to get involved with strangers. Emily tried to ignore it, but the weight of the situation lingered constantly. One Saturday, Emily decided to return to the park a little later, when the children had gone home and the adults were starting to disperse. She walked toward the bench where the woman used to sit, her steps hesitant. When she got there, she found the bench empty, but a sense of discomfort washed over her. The silence was deep, but it was heavy with an inexplicable expectation. That's when she heard the sound of quick footsteps behind her. She turned around, and there he was, the short-haired officer with the stern expression, the one she'd encountered before. He looked at her almost intimidatingly. "You shouldn't be here alone, Emily," he said bluntly. The girl swallowed hard, feeling the pressure mounting. I just wanted to see if she was here. The woman, the one with the officers." The officer frowned, as if assessing every word she said. "Don't get involved with this girl. It's not your business." He stepped closer, his tone now more severe. "What you did was a mistake. The woman, you don't know who she really is." Emily felt confused, her stomach tightening. And what did she do? Why are the officers always here? The officer glanced around before moving closer, almost whispering, "She's not who you think. If you know what's good for you, you'll stay away from her." Before Emily could respond, the man quickly walked away, disappearing in the opposite direction. She stood there alone, her heart pounding in her chest. What did he mean by that? What more was there to this elderly woman who seemed so harmless? Something in his voice, something in the officer's eyes, told her that the truth was being hidden. In the following days, Emily began to investigate. She knew something wasn't right, and her curiosity wouldn't let her rest. She started asking discreet questions to her classmates, trying to find out if anyone knew more about the woman, but no one seemed to know anything. It was as if the woman had never existed before, appearing on the park bench. Then, one afternoon, when the girl passed by the spot where she always saw the woman, something different caught her attention. There was a small sign leaning against the tree near the bench that she'd never noticed before. It was a simple sign, but as she read the words, her heart raced. "Caution! Crime area!" Emily looked around, but no one seemed to be paying attention to her. She approached the sign, her nervousness growing. She looked once more at the empty bench. Crime area. What did that mean? She thought about the elderly woman, and all she knew was that she wasn't there by accident. What was the police hiding? That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She spent hours tossing and turning in bed, her mind full of questions. She couldn't ignore the feeling that something deeply wrong was happening, something far beyond the simple plea for help from a beggar. The next morning, as she went back to school, she noticed the police were back at the park, but now there was something else. A black van was parked near the bench, and a group of officers was gathered around a man in a suit who seemed to be in charge of the operation. Emily didn't know what to do, but she knew she couldn't just stand still. She approached discreetly, observing the scene from a distance. The man in the suit seemed to be talking urgently to the officers, and then made a gesture for the van to be opened. When the door opened, Emily almost gasped in surprise. Inside, tied up and visibly injured, was the elderly woman. But it wasn't just her in the van. Beside the woman were other men, their faces covered and their clothes dirty. They looked like part of some covert operation, something Emily never could have imagined. And in that moment, the truth started to form in the girl's mind. The woman wasn't just a beggar, she was connected to something much bigger, something dangerous. And Emily, somehow, was at the center of it all. Emily could hardly believe what she was seeing. The elderly woman, whom she had thought was just a beggar forgotten by life, was now in police custody, surrounded by men with threatening looks. The black van, with its dark windows and closed doors, seemed to be hiding much more than she could see. She felt an increasing urge to uncover the truth, but also growing pressure to stay away from it, especially since the police were involved. The officers ignored her, but Emily knew something wasn't right. She followed at a distance, keeping herself hidden in the shadows until the van disappeared from the park, taking the elderly woman and the mysterious men with it. The place, which had once seemed calm and peaceful, was slowly turning into a backdrop for something much darker. What was it with those people? What did the crime area mean? As the officers dispersed, Emily knew she was being watched. She didn't know how, but she felt like she was being followed all the time. Her steps grew heavier as she walked home, trying to ignore the feeling of being followed. At night, the shadows seemed to take on a more threatening form, and simply looking out the window of her room became unnerving. What was the police trying to hide? And more importantly, what was her role in all of this? In the days that followed, the tension only increased. Emily avoided the park and stayed away from the police, but the feeling that something was about to happen wouldn't leave her. At school, she tried to keep up a normal facade, but the truth was, her mind was fixated on the woman and the mystery surrounding the park. She had to know more, and somehow she felt that she had been marked by that encounter. It was then that she started hearing rumors. Among her schoolmates, she learned that the elderly woman wasn't just any beggar. She was known by a few, but in a very peculiar way. She had a history of mysterious disappearances, and according to the gossip, she was linked to a clandestine group involved in illegal activities. Emily didn't know whether to believe it, but the fact that the police were so involved only confirmed her worst fears. She started investigating on her own, going to libraries and talking to some of the older people in the neighborhood. That's when one elderly woman, who had lived on that street for years, gave her a name. "Her name is Margaret," the woman said with a grave look. "Margaret Stone. I've never seen anyone as wicked as her." A chill ran down Emily's spine. Margaret Stone, what happened to her? The woman hesitated, looking around before continuing. "They say she was a normal housewife, but after an accident, something changed in her. People started disappearing around her. I heard she was arrested years ago, but then she disappeared, or was released. And since then, no one has seen her except on the streets, like a beggar." The revelation hit like a bomb. Emily didn't know what to think. All she knew was that this woman, who seemed like a lost soul, was tied to something much bigger. But why was she in her life now? Why had their paths crossed? In the weeks that followed, the police investigations seemed to die down, but Emily couldn't stop thinking about what she had discovered. She knew she was taking risks, but she couldn't walk away from the mystery. Something inside her told her she needed to understand what was behind all of this. She wanted to help, but she also felt a growing sense of danger. It was then that one night after school, she received a message from an unknown number. "You can't hide. The answer is closer than you think." Emily almost dropped her phone in surprise. Who was behind the message, and what did it mean by the answer? Her mind spun with questions, but she knew she couldn't stand still. Something was about to happen, and she was in the middle of it. At that moment, Emily decided to dig deeper. If she had to face whatever was ahead, she couldn't do it alone. She would look for someone who could help her. She thought of James, her closest friend, someone who, although skeptical, always had her back. But even he seemed to be involved in something bigger than he realized. James, in his own attempts to help Emily, was also starting to realize that the truth was closer and darker than they could comprehend. The circle of mystery and danger was closing in around them. What had seemed like a simple story of a chance encounter was now turning into a plot full of twists, and Emily knew the answers could be darker than she had ever imagined. The night Emily received the mysterious message, something inside her urged her to act. She felt as though she was being watched, but at the same time, her curiosity outweighed her fear. On a rainy afternoon, with the streets deserted, she decided to take a bolder step. James, though hesitant, agreed to help her. The two of them met at the school after hours. With their hearts pounding, they planned a route that would take them to the intersection Emily believed was at the heart of all the truth. They would head to the park, where it all began, and try to uncover more about Margaret Stone, the woman who now seemed to be the epicenter of something much larger. When they arrived at the park, the scene was eerily calm. There were no signs of police, and the bench was empty as always. The rain had subsided, but the sky remained overcast, creating an atmosphere of mystery and desolation. Emily looked around, feeling a knot in her stomach. Something was about to happen. Suddenly, a shadow approached from where they were hiding near the trees. It was a tall man with a cold expression, wearing a dark coat that made him seem even more imposing. Emily swallowed hard when she realized he wasn't there by accident. The man stopped in front of them and, without a word, motioned for them to follow him to a more secluded area of the park. "Margaret is waiting for you," he said in a deep voice, but with no apparent emotion. Emily and James exchanged a glance, unsure of what to do. The response message Emily had received now felt more like a threat, but the sense that they were very close to the truth was stronger than any fear they might have felt. They followed the man, trying to remain calm. They were led to a small cabin hidden among the trees, a place they had never noticed before. When they entered, the inside of the cabin was dim, except for a single light in the center, illuminating a wooden table with several papers scattered across it. In the corner, a chair was empty, and Emily felt a presence. She knew she was closer to the answer than ever. And then she appeared. Margaret Stone, the woman who seemed like a simple beggar, was sitting there in a corner of the cabin with a calm expression. Her eyes, normally dull and confused, were now sharp and observant. She looked at Emily with an enigmatic smile, as if she already knew what was happening. Her grey hair was cleaner, and her face, though aged, seemed more like a mask, hiding secrets Emily could barely imagine. "I knew you'd come, Emily," Margaret said in a soft voice, but with an unexpected strength. Emily's heart raced. "You knew? How?" Margaret didn't respond right away. She looked at James, who was standing next to Emily, and then her expression softened. "Because you have something others don't," she said, pausing. "You have courage, and that's something many lose as they go through life." James, confused and uncomfortable, stepped forward. "What are you saying? Who are you, really? And what's going on here?" Margaret slowly stood up, her fragile body seeming almost harmless, but something in her eyes said otherwise. She walked over to the table where the papers were and pointed to a specific document with an old seal. "This," she said, "is the key to everything, a secret that was buried many years ago." Emily stepped closer and saw what was written on the paper. "Operation Aurora, Investigation Report." Hadim! The seal indicated that the report was linked to a secret government agency, something related to mysterious disappearances and the vanishing of seemingly innocent people who were actually part of a clandestine project. Margaret's name was there, associated with an abandoned experiment involving memory manipulation and the creation of false identities. The truth exploded in Emily's mind. Margaret Stone was not just a victim of the system. She was involved in something much bigger, and somehow Emily's fate was now intertwined with this mystery. But before Emily could process all the information, the man who had led them there entered the cabin, now with a threatening expression. "She's told you enough," he said, staring hard at Emily. "Now we need to make sure you don't learn more." The man approached quickly, and Emily realized she was in danger. Panic took over her body, but before she could react, something unexpected happened. Margaret, with a strength no one expected from her, stepped forward and, with impressive agility, knocked the man down, who fell to the ground with a muffled scream. "You're not going to control me anymore," she said, her voice filled with anger and desperation. James, who had been in shock, finally reacted. "Emily, let's get out of here." But before they could do anything, the man on the ground, now struggling to get up, shouted, "You have no idea what you're getting into. The truth is closer to you than you think, but now you won't be able to escape." The tension in the air was palpable. Emily knew she was at a crossroads. Something bigger than herself was about to unfold, and she was more involved than ever. Emily was stunned. Everything she thought she knew about the homeless woman and the police seemed to have turned into a nightmare bigger than she could have imagined. Margaret's sudden reaction, shoving the aggressive man and speaking with an authority no one expected from her, was only the beginning of a chain of events she couldn't control. The reactions from her two friends were starting to take an irreversible turn. "Let's go, fast!" James yelled, grabbing Emily's arm. But she was paralyzed by the scene unfolding before her. The man, now struggling to get up off the ground, glared at Margaret with rage, but didn't advance. Instead, he made a strange motion, almost as if retreating. "They're going to come for you, Margaret. They always do. You have nowhere left to hide." Margaret looked at him with unsettling calm. "They've found me before, and they always underestimate what I can do." A chill ran down Emily's spine. Who were they? Why was the man so sure that Margaret and she were in danger now? She knew she needed to leave this place as quickly as possible, but the feeling of being involved in something much bigger than a simple police case was overwhelming. Margaret took a step toward Emily. "You have to know, girl. The truth about what's happening isn't going to be easy to swallow, but you're here now, and you're going to understand everything, sooner or later." "Understand everything about what?" Emily asked, her throat dry. "About what's happening to you. What is this Operation Aurora?" Margaret shook her head with a sad smile. "You won't be able to escape this. They're coming after you now, because you saw what you weren't supposed to." James pulled her by the arm, forcing her to leave the cabin. "Emily, we need to go now. We'll call the police." But Emily couldn't move. Margaret's face was imprinted on her mind, and the woman's words echoed in her ears. "You saw what you weren't supposed to." Emily was terrified, but also felt that somehow this was some sort of fate. It wasn't just about what was happening now. It was about something much deeper, a complex web she couldn't ignore. "I need to understand, James," she said, her voice firm despite the overwhelming fear. "We can't just run from this. I need to know why this is happening, why we're being dragged into it." James hesitated, looking at the door of the cabin, as if expecting the police or the mysterious men to show up at any moment. He knew Emily was stepping into dangerous territory, but also knew she wouldn't turn back. Suddenly, the sound of sirens cut through the air, distant but getting closer every second. Emily knew they didn't have much time. They were surrounded. "Emily, if you're doing this out of curiosity, you're putting us at risk," James said, his voice now filled with panic. "But if you're right, we'll face it together." It was in that moment that Emily made her decision. There was no turning back. They could no longer just be spectators. Something much bigger than them was unfolding right before their eyes, and now they were at the center of it. "I need to go back to the city. I need to talk to someone. I don't know what it is, but I know Margaret's right. I can't run from this," Emily said, her voice trembling with emotion, but firm in her resolve. They hurried out of the cabin, but as they were almost out of the park, something unexpected happened. They saw a black van parked on the road ahead, its doors open. The tall, dark figure of one of the men who had been watching them appeared in the van's entrance. He wasn't alone. 3 other men emerged from the vehicle, all silent, their faces partially hidden by hoods. "Emily, James!" The low voice of the man from before sounded cold and menacing. "Now you're part of this, and there's no escaping. The only choice left is what you'll do with what you know." James instinctively stepped in front of Emily, as if trying to protect her, but there was nowhere to run. The group surrounded them. "But you don't know what's behind all of this," Emily shouted, trying to stay calm. "You don't know who's really behind it, who's controlling it all." The man leading the group smiled faintly, as though he was enjoying Emily's panic. "You think you know enough to understand. I'm part of what you can't see, and if you know too much, there'll be no turning back." James looked at Emily, his expression torn between frustration and fear. He wanted to fight, but he knew a confrontation would be useless. But Emily? She knew there was something even bigger at play, something hiding behind these men's threats, and she was about to find out what it really meant to be a part of this story. Breathing heavily, with adrenaline coursing through her veins, Emily knew that the next decision could change everything. But one thing was clear: she couldn't turn back. The game was just beginning. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. The men in front of Emily and James weren't just agents of fear. They represented something much bigger, something that transcended any logic or reason. Emily felt the growing pressure, as if she were being pushed toward an endless abyss, and yet she knew she could no longer retreat. James was still in front of her, but the two of them were surrounded by a web of mystery and danger. The black van remained there, silent, watching them. The men around them were motionless, but their piercing gazes said it all. They were ready to act at any moment. "You have a choice, Emily," said the leader of the group, his eyes dark as the depths of night. "Join us or face the consequences." Emily felt the weight of those words, and for a moment, fear almost made her give in. But then Margaret's words echoed in her mind. "The truth is closer to you than you think." She knew that her only chance of escaping this situation and understanding what was really going on was to go all the way, no matter the cost. It was time to uncover the truth, whatever it took. "I'm not here to join anyone," Emily said, her voice now stronger than she'd ever imagined. "I'm here to understand, and I'll do it no matter what." James looked at her, surprised by the determination reflected in Emily's eyes. He knew she was on a personal mission now, something beyond mere curiosity. She was completely involved, and more than that, there was a spark of courage in her gaze. "James, let's face them. They won't intimidate us," Emily said, her voice now filled with strength. The man in front of them smiled, but not with pleasure. It seemed almost disillusioned. "You're brave, but there's something you still don't understand. You're not just fighting against us. You're fighting against a system much bigger than you can imagine, and if you keep seeking the truth, you'll uncover things that will make you regret it." But Emily didn't let herself be shaken. She knew there was no turning back. She had taken the first step, and now she couldn't stop. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, resolute. "I won't stop until I know the truth. Give me the answer. I need to understand what's going on." There was something in her tone that seemed to finally crack the man's mask of indifference. He seemed to weigh his words for a moment, then nodded to the others. "She already knows too much, so it's useless to continue with the threats," the leader murmured. "Take them." The other men moved quickly, grabbing Emily and James with strong hands. Emily, however, didn't go down without a fight. She struggled, shoving one of the men back with all her strength. She felt the fear and adrenaline surge through her body, but she also felt something else, a deep desire to survive, to understand the mystery that now seemed so close and yet so distant at the same time. James was by her side, doing the same. He knew the only way to escape these people was to keep fighting, and maybe find a way to turn the situation in their favor. They were now caught in the middle of a dangerous game, but the flame of overcoming and seeking the truth was guiding them. In the moment of highest tension, when it seemed like nothing could be done, a strange calm settled over Emily. She remembered the message Margaret had sent her. "You have courage." She was on a journey that no one else would choose, but she knew she was the only one who could unravel what was hidden behind the veil of mystery. Suddenly, one of the men looked at her with an expression of surprise. She doesn't know what she's doing. She's risking too much." But the truth was, Emily was no longer just trying to escape. She was absorbing every movement, every word, every gesture of these men. She began to realize that the key to defeating them wasn't in the physical struggle, but in understanding the game she was now involved in. It wasn't just about facing the men, it was about dismantling the network that controlled them. She turned to James, whose eyes were also shining with renewed determination. They weren't going to stop, not until they understood what was behind this organization and who was controlling it. The inner battle within Emily was clear. She didn't just want to survive, she wanted to know the truth, no matter what happened next. She was prepared for whatever was necessary. She knew that time was against them, and the pressure on her shoulders was only increasing. But now she was ready to risk even more. When one of the men closest to her approached, trying to hold her, Emily looked him straight in the eyes and said, "You can arrest me, you can try to stop me, but you can't hide the truth forever." The man hesitated, and in that moment of uncertainty, Emily saw an opening. The doubt in his eyes. She knew she wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Something had changed in her. She wasn't at a disadvantage anymore. She was learning to use the weaknesses of those surrounding her. James noticed the change in her as well and made a quick move, surprising the other men by pushing one of them aside. The chance to escape was right there, in front of them. "Let's go!" Emily shouted, grabbing James's hand and running. The adrenaline pushed them forward, and she felt the weight of the risk, but also the urgency to take control of her own fate. They had taken a crucial step toward uncovering the truth, and now there was no turning back. They were ready to face whatever it took to expose the network behind it all. The biting wind of the night felt colder than ever, howling through the trees around them as Emily and James ran through the forest. Their hearts pounded to the rapid rhythm of their escape, and the police sirens, which had once sounded distant, now seemed to be closing in from all sides. The sound of the street lamps was muffled by the frantic pace of their footsteps, but to Emily, that was a blessing. They were still moving, still had a chance. "We can't keep running, Emily," James said, breathless. He was exhausted, but the determination in his eyes was unwavering. "We need to figure out what to do now. What are we going to tell the police? They won't believe us." Emily gazed at the horizon, where the city lights were beginning to appear. It was the only place they could seek help, but the thought of involving the police sent a chill down her spine. How could she explain all of this? How could she trust those who, in theory, were supposed to protect them? Did she truly understand the magnitude of the threat they were facing? James, the police can't help us. Not like we thought they could. They're all in on it. They know everything. The words came out with alarming clarity, and James looked at her with a bewildered expression. You're saying that the police are involved in this? With the guys in the van? With all of this? James stopped, as if trying to comprehend the magnitude of what Emily had just said. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the shadows of the forest ahead. The fear of being followed was there, lurking in the back of her mind. But there was something else, an increasing feeling that the pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit. Margaret's words, "The truth is closer than you think," echoed with a force she couldn't fully grasp yet, but it was beginning to make sense. James stepped closer, placing his hand on her shoulder again, his expression serious. "So what are we waiting for? If we know we can't trust the police, we need to dig deeper, right? We need to get to the truth, to the heads of this organization. And I'm with you, Emily." Emily looked at him, feeling a weight lift from her chest. The mutual trust between them was growing with every passing moment, and she knew she couldn't face this alone. "That's it. We need to go after who's behind all of this. We have to take the next step, James." They spent the next few minutes assessing the situation. The city lights were getting closer, but Emily knew the police wouldn't be the solution. They needed to figure out who was really behind all of this and what Margaret's role was in this web of mystery and manipulation. "I know it's risky, but I need to try talking to Margaret again. She knows more than she's letting on. She's the key to all of this," Emily declared, with a resolve in her eyes that James had never seen before. "Are you sure?" James asked, still somewhat apprehensive. "She's involved in something huge, and you could be putting your life at risk by going after her." "I know what I'm doing, James. I have to do this, or I'll never understand what's really going on," Emily replied firmly. She looked at him, a spark of determination in her eyes. "But we need to hurry. I don't know how much time we have before they realize we're on the run." With that decision made, the two of them headed toward the meeting spot Margaret had mentioned, a remote location on the outskirts of the city, where the answers Emily had been searching for might finally be revealed. They knew they were heading straight for the epicenter of what seemed to be a much larger power game than they could understand. As they neared the location, Emily felt the pieces finally coming together. The mysterious figures in the van, Margaret's cryptic words, and even the police officer's reactions, all of it pointed to one truth. Something big was being orchestrated behind the scenes, and they were somehow key players in this game. But what? And why? On the empty road, the city lights behind them began to blur as they got closer to the meeting point. A sinister silence hung in the air. There was no more time to hesitate. When they arrived at the location, a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't Margaret, but someone more familiar. The man who had spoken to them earlier, the leader of the black van. He was waiting, standing alone, with the posture of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. "I knew you'd come. You couldn't stay away from the truth for long," the man said with an enigmatic smile. "But you won't like what you're going to find." Emily swallowed hard but didn't back down. "We're here to understand what's going on. We're not leaving here without the answers." The man took a step forward, his hands in his pockets, and before he could say anything else, Emily interrupted him. "Where's Margaret? I need to talk to her. I already know you know more than you're letting on." He looked her straight in the eye, as if weighing his words. "You're right. I know a lot more than you think, Emily. And what you're about to find out will change everything. What started with a simple choice to give a sandwich to a homeless woman has turned into something much bigger. Now, you're at the center of it, and it's time for you to make the final decision." Emily felt the knot in her throat tighten, but there was also a spark of courage growing within her. She knew that what was coming next wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. She and James were about to face a revelation they could never have imagined. And maybe, just maybe, this was the moment to finally understand what Margaret had meant with those mysterious words about the truth. The darkness of the night surrounded them, creating an intoxicating atmosphere of suspense. The man in front of them, the mysterious leader of the organization, seemed to be waiting for them with a chilling calm. The tension in the air was palpable, as though something huge was about to happen. Emily and James were ready for whatever it might be, or at least they thought they were. "You're right," the man said, now smiling enigmatically. "What started as a simple exchange of a sandwich has turned into something much bigger, like a thread of yarn that you pull and suddenly reveals the entire fabric of reality." He took a step forward, almost reverently. "You've risked too much, Emily. Now, there's no turning back." Emily felt her body tremble, but it wasn't from fear. It was from anticipation. She had been preparing for this moment for so long that, in a way, she had been expecting the big reveal. She knew there was no way out now. It was time for the truth. "Where is Margaret?" Emily asked, her eyes fixed on the man in front of her. Her voice was firm, without a trace of doubt. "I know she's involved in this. I know she has all the answers." The man looked down the dark road, as if seeing something beyond what human eyes could perceive. Then, with a barely noticeable sigh, he said, "Margaret. Margaret is in a place you never imagined she'd be. She was the key to making all this possible, and now she's beyond any control that you or I can exercise." Those words echoed in Emily's mind like a distant scream. Margaret was the key. For a moment, she thought everything had been orchestrated from the start, that Margaret knew what she was doing when she passed along that message. But that didn't make sense. Margaret didn't seem like the villain, didn't seem like someone who manipulated others. She had helped Emily. How could she be behind all of this? "You still don't get it, do you?" The man seemed to enjoy Emily's confusion. "Margaret was essential, but not in the way you think. She's not your ally, Emily. She never was." The revelation hit like a bomb, and Emily felt a wave of shock invade her. The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet as she tried to process what he had just said. The image she had of Margaret, someone she trusted and believed in, started to unravel. "But she sent me the messages. She told me the truth was closer than I thought. She knew I was being chased." Emily tried to refute, her mind still struggling to piece together the puzzle. The man slowly shook his head. "Yes, she knew. She was manipulating you. Every move you made, every decision you took was being watched. And everything she did was to get you to this exact moment where the truth will be revealed." James, who had been silent by Emily's side until then, finally spoke, his voice tense. "You're saying Margaret was manipulating us all along? That we were pawns in a bigger game?" The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he simply looked at Emily, as if waiting for her to understand on her own. "Margaret isn't here because she doesn't need to be. She's already done her part. You, Emily, are the key piece now." Emily took a step back, trying to process everything that was happening. She felt her stomach churn, and a sense of betrayal and confusion took over her body. How could she have been so blind? How had she missed the clues along the way? Why had Margaret, who seemed like her ally, put her in this position? "What are you trying to say? That Margaret was part of all of this? That she was part of the organization that's now chasing me?" Emily asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. The man looked at her with a look that seemed to show a faint sadness. Margaret wasn't an active part of the organization, but she knew what was going on. In a way, she was an intermediary. She helped set the stage. But you, Emily, you are the true target of this whole process. You are the key to something far bigger than you can imagine. He then made a subtle movement, and suddenly Margaret's figure appeared from the shadows, stepping out like a ghost. Emily swallowed hard at the sight of the woman who had once been her ally, but who now seemed different. Her eyes, once kind, were now empty, as if there was no humanity left. "Margaret," Emily murmured, the weight of the words sinking into her chest. Margaret looked at her with a cold, distant expression. "You made it this far, but what you didn't realize, Emily, is that you were chosen. You've always been the key. And now, your journey is just beginning. You're telling me that everything that's happened, all the secrets, all the manipulations, was about me?" Emily asked, her voice shaky, but with a thread of anger. Margaret took a deep breath. Yes, you were chosen from the very beginning. That sandwich you gave to that woman, it was the start of a long journey you unconsciously chose to follow. And the game that's now unfolding is only at its beginning. Those words hit like a final blow, and Emily found herself caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She had been chosen, but for what? And by whom? Why her? What was behind this game that until now she couldn't understand? James took her hand, squeezing it tightly. He knew what was at stake, but he also knew they couldn't turn back now. Their fate was irrevocably tied to the truth that was now unfolding before them. So, what's the next step? Emily asked, with a resolve that reflected an inner strength she didn't even know she had. What happens now? The man smiled slowly. Now, Emily, you must make your choice. The truth you've been seeking, it's finally in front of you. But now it's up to you what you'll do with it. Those words from Margaret echoed in Emily's mind like a distant sound. The truth was before her, but what did that really mean? Everything she thought she knew about the world, about herself, was being torn apart. The lie she had believed to be the guiding thread of her life now seemed like the tip of a much bigger, more complex iceberg. She had been chosen, but for what? And what did that mean for her future and for James's? James gripped her hand even tighter, his fingers clenched around hers, as if trying to anchor her, to cancel out the confusion spreading through her mind. He seemed shaken too, but he didn't want to show weakness. His gaze at Margaret and the man was steady, determined, but there was a shadow of uncertainty in it. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to fight against something so vast. They were up against a web of manipulation, something beyond anything they'd ever experienced. Choice, Emily repeated, her voice faltering again as if trying to understand the weight of the words that had been said. What does that mean? What do you mean by choose? Margaret, now standing in front of her, seemed farther away, as though her humanity had been ripped away, leaving only a cold, calculating shell. You have two options, Emily, she said, her voice unsettlingly calm. You can go back to your life, pretend none of this ever happened, or you can accept what you've discovered and do something with it. Change the course of everything. Emily stared at her, her anger mixed with sadness in her eyes. Margaret, the woman she had believed was her friend, was now suggesting that she take a path that seemed impossible. How could anyone go back to their normal life after discovering that everything they had lived through was, in some way, manipulated? Are you saying I should forget all this? Emily asked, her voice wavering. That I should go back to my life like nothing happened? Yes, Margaret answered with an almost terrifying indifference. But you know you can't, not after everything you've learned. Emily felt her stomach tighten. She knew Margaret was right. There was no way to simply erase what she had discovered. The weight of the truth was crushing, and now she knew she was involved in something much bigger, something involving powerful people, intricate manipulations, and perhaps even lives at stake. What happens if I don't go back? Emily asked, staring at the man and Margaret as if searching for an escape. She had already realized that the choice being given to her wasn't really a choice. It was a dilemma, a riddle with no clear solution. What will happen to me if I accept the truth and try to change things? The man smiled enigmatically, his eyes shining with an almost hypnotic intensity. If you choose the path of truth, there's no going back. You'll become part of a game that's beyond your expectations, beyond everything you've ever seen. Those who have the power to manipulate others, and now you hold the key, will never see the world the same way again. You will have control, Emily. James looked at the man with distrust. And who are you to give this choice? What do you gain from it? The man looked at him with a cold smile. We gain nothing. This isn't about power or control. It's about revealing who you really are, Emily. He paused, watching the impact of his words. You were chosen because, deep down, you already know. You already know what to do. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. She looked at James, who was gazing at her with a deep, understanding look. He knew that something much bigger was at stake, but he didn't fully grasp the implications. And maybe that was the most terrifying part of it all. She looked back at Margaret, trying to understand what her presence there meant. If she had been an ally, if she had truly been part of this choice, what could she have hidden? What was behind her actions? And most importantly, why was she so distant now? Why wasn't she trying to explain or trying to save Emily from some dark fate? But Margaret's gaze, like the man's, was one of unwavering coldness. They weren't there to save anyone. They were there to play a part in a game. And now, Emily was at the center of it all. What would happen now? Would she take the risk, or would she give up everything and go back to her old life, as if nothing had changed? "Emily, no matter what you choose," Margaret said, her voice almost like a sentence, "you're already immersed in this. The future of everyone is now intertwined with your choices. There's so much at stake, more than you can imagine." James looked at her, his words weighing on her like a burden. "What will you do, Emily? I'm with you, no matter what you choose." Emily looked at him, feeling the weight of the moment. She knew that by making her decision, she was not just affecting her life, but the lives of everyone around her. She had the power to change everything or walk away and try to go on as if nothing had changed. But deep down, she knew there was no turning back. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place, and now she had a role to play. She looked at the man and Margaret, feeling the decision was hers to make. "I choose," Emily said, her voice steady with determination. "I choose to face the truth." She knew that by making this choice, she was embracing an uncertain future, but she also knew that the truth was something that could not be ignored. The game was now in her hands. With her choice made, Emily felt a heavy weight settle on her shoulders, but at the same time, a sense of clarity washed over her. She finally understood that life was no longer about following a familiar path, but about venturing into uncharted territory, full of uncertainties. The future wouldn't be easy, but she now knew what she had to do. The truth was not just a burden, it was a key to something much greater. "You've chosen," the man said with a satisfied smile. "Now the real challenge begins." The words echoed in her mind as she looked at James, her companion in this journey. He seemed calm, but she knew he shared the same confusion, the same insecurity that had plagued her throughout this twisted path. Deep down, she knew he couldn't follow her in the same direction. There was a thin line between the two worlds she was about to cross. "Let's leave," Emily said, turning to James, her voice now firmer. She knew the decisions they made from here on out could change everything, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. James nodded without a word. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Everything they knew was about to be confronted by the truth, and the truth, at its core, had no way back. The man guiding them seemed content to let Emily take the lead, but Margaret didn't move. She stayed there, watching with a vacant expression, as though Emily's choice was inevitable, but not something she truly wanted to see happen. "I know you have no more doubts, Emily," Margaret said coldly, "but be careful what you wish for. The path you've chosen is dangerous, and there will be no turning back." "I know," Emily replied, her voice steady but her heart racing. "I've already accepted the risk." With that, she took the first step. But it wasn't a step she took alone. She knew somehow James was by her side. Even though the future was uncertain, he was with her, and that gave her strength. But now she was facing something much bigger. The game now was more than just a personal choice. It was about the truth, about a power she hadn't even known she possessed. And more importantly, it was about the very structure that governed their lives and the manipulation that stretched behind everything. As they moved forward, Emily felt Margaret's eyes on her back and couldn't help the chill that ran down her spine. She knew Margaret was aware of something she didn't fully understand yet. What exactly did Margaret have to do with all this? She was part of something bigger, but what was this something that now seemed so distant and immeasurable? As Emily and James moved farther from the place where everything had begun, something began to form in her mind, a perception of the truth that still lay hidden in the shadows. What exactly did Margaret know? How did she fit into the game Emily was now starting to understand? The questions grew louder as their steps echoed through the silent night. But while the answers seemed so far away, Emily knew time was not on her side. The clock was ticking, and every decision she made from now on would have an irreversible impact. The journey had only just begun. As the days passed, the tension between Emily and James grew. They didn't talk much about what had happened the night they made their choice. Emily felt the weight of Margaret's words, and the uncertainty of her decision hung over her like a persistent shadow. Something was about to happen, and she didn't know exactly what, but she knew she could no longer turn back. The decision had been made, and now she had to prepare for the consequences. Every movement she made seemed to be watched, as if the world around her had changed. She was no longer just living her life. Now, she was in a much larger game, a game whose rules she was still trying to understand. The images of Margaret and the man who had guided them were etched in her mind, and she felt there was something more behind their words, something about to be revealed. One afternoon, while James was out, Emily was alone in her apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened. She picked up her phone and started searching for information about the organization Margaret had mentioned. Maybe if she could better understand who these people were and what they wanted from her, she could prepare herself better. But every search she did seemed to only increase her confusion. There wasn't much in the results, just vague stories and articles about conspiracy theories and secret organizations, but nothing that could give her clear answers. It was then that she received a message from an unknown number, causing her heart to race. It was short, direct, with no explanation. The time is coming. Prepare yourself. Emily stared at her phone for a moment, trying to process the message. Who could it be from? Someone in Margaret's group? Someone else involved? She tried calling James, but the call went unanswered. Feeling unsettled, a sharp sense of worry crept in. Something was about to happen, something she couldn't stop. That night when James finally returned home, he found her visibly shaken. She tried to hide it, but the nervousness was impossible to mask. What happened? James asked, noticing her expression. He approached her, concerned. I got a message, Emily said in a quiet voice. It said that the time is coming, that we need to prepare. James furrowed his brow. Prepare for what? What does it mean? Emily sighed and looked at him, a mix of fear and resolve in her eyes. I don't know, but it feels like we're about to get caught up in something bigger, something beyond our control. They stood in silence for a moment, the words hanging in the air. Emily knew that, at this point, it wasn't about choice anymore. Whatever was coming couldn't be avoided. Their fates were now intertwined with something darker, something grander, something they might not fully comprehend. The next day, a new twist hit them. They were contacted by a police officer who asked to meet them in a secluded spot. When they arrived, they didn't find an ordinary cop, but someone who seemed to know far too much about what was happening. The mysterious figure observed them with an unsettling intensity. You two need to understand that you're no longer in control, the agent said, his voice deep and serious. What Margaret and the man told you, that was just the tip of the iceberg. Emily and James exchanged worried glances, their hearts racing with the realization that up until now, they had been manipulated by forces much larger than they had imagined. What does that mean? Emily asked, her voice trembling. Who's behind all of this? The agent looked around, making sure they were safe, before speaking again. I can't reveal too much. But what I can tell you is that what happened between you two, what Margaret wanted, is part of a bigger plan, something that's about to unfold on a level that will affect everyone's lives. What you discovered, Emily, isn't something you can ignore. A chill ran down Emily's spine. The agent was saying that by making her choice, by accepting the truth, she had stirred something much larger, and now she was at the center of it all. But what was this bigger plan? What were they trying to accomplish, and why had she been chosen to be part of it? We're ready to move forward, the agent continued, but you need to understand that you can't go back. The road ahead will be dangerous, and the choices you make will affect the fate of many people. We're ready, Emily said, her voice firm, even though fear was growing inside her. But what do we need to do? The agent looked at her, his eyes locked on hers, as if assessing her determination. The first step will be to find the people who can really make a difference, and for that, you'll need to trust me. The tension was palpable. The conversation was becoming more cryptic and at the same time more urgent. Something was coming, something even the police couldn't fully anticipate. But one thing was clear. Emily and James's lives would never be the same. The night was silent, but the weight of the agent's words still hung over Emily. The road ahead will be dangerous, and the choices you make will affect the fate of many people. She didn't know what was more frightening, the direct threat she felt in the air, or the growing sense that her life was about to intertwine with a game whose rules she still didn't understand. She no longer had control over the events. All she had was the sense that something huge was unfolding around her. James was by her side, but even he seemed distant. What had brought them together so far? The questions, the uncertainties, had transformed into a web of lies and manipulation. The image of Margaret, her cold, distant gaze, flashed through Emily's mind. What did she know that they still didn't? The agent's message, his lack of clear answers, felt like a ticking time bomb ready to explode. Emily had made her choice. Now, the clock was ticking, and the consequences could be irreversible. "We're being watched," James suddenly said, breaking the silence. He was looking around with suspicion, as if he could see something that she couldn't. Emily didn't need to respond. She knew. Something was approaching, something much bigger than she could have ever imagined. She felt her chest tighten, the fear growing with every passing second. But there was also something else, a sense of strength, of power, as if the truth she now carried was granting her a new identity. She could no longer turn back, no longer live in the shadows of ignorance. She knew that from this moment on, everything would change. What was about to happen was no longer just a matter of personal choice. It was a matter of survival. The exact moment Emily began to wonder what would come next, the sound of a siren cut through the night. One, then another, several in fact. The noise of tires cutting through asphalt, a feeling of imminent danger filled the air. She looked at James, who was now visibly tense. "They're coming, the police, we can't hide anymore." It was too late. The house they were in was surrounded. The sound of sirens growing louder was not just a threat. It was the confirmation that the game was finally in motion. Emily didn't know if this was an ambush or an attempt to protect those involved, but the outcome would be the same. She was about to be confronted with the reality of everything that had happened. The police were everywhere, and Emily, with a growing sense of inevitability inside her, knew that the time had come to face everything she had started, to test the choices she had made. Before she could react, the door was kicked in, and an officer entered her apartment. His gaze was one of pure determination. Emily barely had time to process what was happening before she was overwhelmed. "Emily Turner," the officer said, his voice firm. "We are here to take you. We have information that you are involved in a large-scale criminal plot. I advise you to cooperate." James immediately stood up, but was quickly restrained by another officer waiting at the entrance. Emily looked at him, her heart pounding. Fear was taking over, but at the same time a part of her still believed that this was all a huge lie. But the police wouldn't make an arrest without reason. They wouldn't surround her house without a purpose. And she knew, deep down, that what was happening had something to do with the message, with the choice she had made days before. "I'm not part of any criminal plot," Emily replied, her voice trembling but with a defiant tone. "I don't know what you're talking about." But the officer didn't seem convinced. "We'll find out. Take her to the station now." What happened next was a quick sequence of events. Emily was taken to the police car, and James was separated from her. Even amid the panic, Emily tried to make sense of what was happening. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but in such a confusing and terrifying way that she could barely keep up. What was being hidden? As the car made its way to downtown, Emily couldn't stop thinking about what Margaret had said. The time is coming. It was clear to her now that she was no longer in control of the situation. The forces at play, those she barely understood, were about to be revealed in all their magnitude. But what exactly had she awakened by choosing the truth? And why was the police so involved? She didn't know the answers to these questions, but one thing she was sure of: the game wasn't over. On the contrary, it was about to reach its peak. The pieces that had been set in motion would finally start to align, and Emily would understand, once and for all, the role she was meant to play in this dark theater. Emily didn't know how much time had passed until she was finally taken into the interrogation room. The cold air of the room contrasted with the growing heat in her chest, her heart pounding against the wall of her ribs. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and the silence of the room felt almost deafening. She could no longer deny it. Everything that had happened up to this point had led her here, to this table, surrounded by police officers and suspicions. She didn't know what awaited her at the station, but she felt that this wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger, something in motion, whose implications could shake the very foundations of what she believed to be reality. The agent who had contacted them appeared at the door of the room, bringing with him a sense of urgency. "Are you ready for the truth?" he asked, his voice deep. He sat down across from her, his expression serious. I don't know what's true anymore," Emily replied, her voice trembling but determined. "I've been told so many things, and it all seems to be blending together. What's happening? Why am I here?" The agent didn't respond immediately. He studied the young woman as if weighing his words. Finally, he took a deep breath and began to explain. "You were chosen, Emily, and this isn't happening by chance. You and James were part of a much larger experiment, an experiment designed to alter the perception of reality, a power game that involves several layers of manipulation and control." He paused, giving her time to let the words settle in her mind. "An experiment?" Emily repeated, unable to believe what she was hearing. "How is that possible? I didn't know anything about this. I just gave a sandwich to an elderly woman, and now I'm being accused of crimes. This is insane." The agent didn't seem to be shaken by her reaction. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "It's not about the sandwich, Emily. It's about what happened afterward. Margaret wasn't just anyone. She was at the center of a much bigger network. And by making that choice, by giving that simple act of kindness, you connected to a chain of events that were orchestrated." The agent placed a thick file on the table. "What you didn't know was that by helping that woman, you became part of a game of manipulation, where your fate, along with many others, was being played by invisible hands. Margaret wasn't just asking for food. She was being used as a pawn in a much more complex puzzle." Emily felt her stomach twist. She tried to make sense of what the agent was saying, but it all felt so surreal, as if she were living in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She wasn't a puppet, not a piece in a game. It couldn't be. "James," she said, more to herself than to the agent. "What happened to him? Is he involved in this too?" The agent nodded. "Yes, he is. You and he share a deeper connection than you realize. Both of you have essential roles to play in the unfolding of this game. But the question now is, what will you choose? The decision you made to help Margaret, to walk this path, is irreversible. It connected you to a network of power that stretches far beyond anyone's understanding." Those words hit Emily like a bucket of cold water. She felt her mind spinning. Connected to a network of power. How could that be possible? She had just given a sandwich, and yet here she was, surrounded by police, being accused of something she didn't even fully understand. "Now, you'll have to decide," the agent continued. "If you want to keep going on this journey, or if you want to try to stop what's in motion, the choice is yours, but it will come with irreversible consequences." Emily looked at the agent, feeling the weight of his words. She didn't know what to choose. Didn't know if there was a way back, but there was something inside her, a force, a growing determination. She couldn't let herself be defeated by this game. She needed to find out more, needed to understand how far this would go. At that moment, the phone in the interrogation room rang. The agent quickly got up and answered, speaking in a low, urgent tone. While he spoke, Emily stared out the window, lost in her thoughts. She felt like her life would never be the same after that day. No matter what happened next, one thing was certain. She had opened a door to a world of mystery, manipulation, and danger. When the agent hung up the phone, he looked at her with renewed intensity. "You need to understand, Emily, what you did was far more significant than it seemed at first. Now the choices you and James make will determine the future of many. There's no going back." Silence filled the room, but Emily already knew. She couldn't hide. The truth was right in front of her, and she had to accept it, no matter how difficult. The pieces of the game were moving quickly now, and she, more than ever, had an important role to play. As the agent stood up to leave, he gave her one last warning. "This is just the beginning, Emily, the start of something much bigger than you can imagine. Prepare yourself." And with that, he left the room, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts, feeling that the fate of many lives was now in her hands. Time passed quickly since that night at the station. Emily still couldn't fully process everything she had learned, but she knew her life would never be the same. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the bigger picture remained largely obscured. She had been drawn into something much larger than she could have ever imagined. She had made the choice to help Margaret, a simple choice driven by compassion. But now she understood that every action has consequences, and some choices connect us to forces beyond our control. What she didn't know, however, was just how far these forces could take her. James had disappeared after the arrest. They had taken him to an unknown location, and though Emily tried in every way possible to contact him, she received no response. What she feared was that he was being used in the same way she was, involved in a plot neither of them fully understood. One morning, weeks later, Emily received a discreet envelope with no return address. Inside, there was only a handwritten note with a simple message: "You are closer than you think." She didn't know who had sent it, but the feeling of being watched never disappeared. She stood up and, for the first time in a long while, felt compelled to act. The choice was now hers. She had a decision to make. The game wasn't over, it had only just begun. But this time, she wouldn't stand still. She knew that her next step could be the most decisive one. Emily grabbed her car keys and headed for the door. The world outside seemed unshakable, but she knew she was about to dive even deeper into the mystery. What had started as a simple act of kindness was now becoming a heavy burden, but also an opportunity. What would she find on that journey? She didn't know, but she was ready to face whatever consequences awaited. And so, with her heart racing, Emily stepped out the door. The future was uncertain, but she was sure of one thing. She had finally understood what it truly meant to make a choice. As Emily walked down the empty street, a new cycle of uncertainty unfolded before her. But something inside her had changed. She was no longer the same girl who, just weeks ago, had given a sandwich to an elderly woman without knowing that small gesture would alter her life forever. Now, with a mission, or perhaps a curse on her hands, Emily felt that the game she was part of was bigger, much bigger, than she could ever fully understand. But something in her soul told her that the outcome of the story rested in the hands of someone much more powerful than her. Or perhaps she herself was the key to the end. One way or another, she had a mission: to uncover the truth, a truth that would undoubtedly change everything. And you, reader, what would you do if you were in Emily's shoes? How would you respond to that enigmatic call to a game that's beyond your comprehension? Her story continues, but her choices and yours will define the next chapter. Share your thoughts, leave your comments, and follow this journey into the unknown. Who knows what comes next? Are you ready to find out?